How Dexter played Doakes. The tension between Sergeant James Doakes and Dexter Morgan is one of the most fascinating psychological dynamics in Dexter. From the very beginning, Doakes is the only one in the Miami Metro Police Department who senses that something is deeply wrong with Dexter. He can't articulate it fully. He doesn't have the evidence to prove it, but he knows. And yet, despite his instincts, Doakes never takes his suspicions public before he's ultimately framed for Dexter's crimes. Doakes' immediate and unwavering suspicion of Dexter is an example of what psychology calls thin slicing, making quick, accurate judgments based on minimal information. As an experienced cop, Doakes had likely encountered countless criminals who had something off about them, even if they didn't display obvious signs of guilt. Dexter's carefully constructed mask worked on everyone else, but Doakes wasn't fooled for a second. But here's the problem. Instincts don't hold up in a court of law. Doakes knew Dexter was dangerous, but knowing and proving are two different things. And because Doakes relied so much on his gut feelings rather than systematically gathering evidence, he never built a solid case. That reliance on intuition, while sharp, ultimately made him vulnerable to his own confirmation bias. He saw Dexter's every action as proof of his guilt, but he didn't have the kind of proof that would convince anyone else. One of the biggest obstacles Doakes faced wasn't even Dexter himself, it was the perception of him within Miami Metro. Dexter had cultivated an image as an awkward, harmless, but brilliant forensics expert. He was respected, even liked. Doakes, on the other hand, had a reputation for being aggressive, intense, and sometimes even hostile. When he started openly harassing Dexter, people didn't take it as a serious investigation. They saw it as just Doakes being Doakes, quick-tempered and suspicious of everyone. There's a psychological principle called the fundamental attribution error, where people tend to see someone's actions as a reflection of their personality rather than their circumstances. In this case, Doakes' anger towards Dexter was perceived as a personal grudge, not a legitimate concern. Because of his brash approach, his warnings were dismissed before he even had a chance to make a case. Why didn't Doakes go around the system? Doakes was an intense guy, but he was also a professional. He believed in law and order and playing by the rules. As much as he wanted to take Dexter down, he wasn't willing to cross ethical or legal lines to do so. If he had been the kind of cop who planted evidence or made up charges, he might have had a chance to at least get Dexter on the department's radar, but that wasn't who he was. Instead, he tried to catch Dexter the right way. He followed him, confronted him, and pushed him, hoping Dexter would slip up. But Dexter wasn't just a killer. He was a meticulous planner, someone who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of deception. Every move Doakes makes, Dexter countered. And when Dexter finally had the chance to turn the tables, he did it flawlessly. One of the things that often gets overlooked in discussions about Doakes is just how exhausting it must have been for him to constantly feel like he was the only one who saw the truth. Imagine knowing, without a doubt, that someone in your workplace is a serial killer, but every time you try to sound the alarm, people either ignore you or think you're crazy. The stress of that would be enormous. There's real psychological research on how prolonged exposure to individuals with psychopathic traits can cause anxiety, paranoia, and even self-doubt in people who sense something is wrong. Dexter wasn't just avoiding suspicion, he was actively gaslighting Doakes, making him look unstable while maintaining his own perfect facade. By the time Doakes finally got his hands on hard evidence, Dexter's blood slides. He was already too deep. Instead of methodically building a case, he panicked and confronted Dexter, which only made it easier for Dexter to flip the script. At the end of the day, Doakes' downfall wasn't just because of Dexter's cunning. It was because of who he was as a person. He was a man who trusted his instincts, who played by the rules, and who never held back his emotions. In another world, those might have been strengths, but against someone like Dexter, they were weaknesses. Dexter understood people in a way Doakes never did. He knew how to manipulate perceptions, how to twist reality just enough to make people doubt what was right in front of them. And when it became clear that Doakes was never going to stop coming after him, Dexter did what he always did. He removed the threat. Not by killing him directly, but by turning all of Doakes' own disadvantages against him. By the time Doakes was locked up in that cabin, branded as the Bay Harbor Butcher, it was already over. Even if he had somehow escaped, he had no credibility left. Dexter had won the psychological battle long before he framed Doakes for his crimes. By the time Doakes was framed as the Bay Harbor Butcher, he had already become completely isolated. His relentless pursuit of Dexter had alienated him from his colleagues, and the more he pressed, the more he seemed irrational in their eyes. This psychological isolation is one of the key reasons why he never took his suspicions public. He had no real support system. Who would believe him? From a psychological standpoint, this kind of alienation is a dangerous place to be. Studies have shown that when people are isolated and their credibility is questioned, they start to doubt their own perceptions. This is why gaslighting is such an effective manipulation tactic. It makes the victim feel like they're the problem, not the person they're targeting. Dexter didn't just avoid Doakes' suspicions, he actively turned them against him. Doakes may have been right, but he was also an angry, intense, and sometimes reckless officer. This made it easier for Dexter to paint him as a man on the edge rather than someone uncovering a terrifying truth. Dexter's strategy, letting Doakes destroy himself. Dexter never outright silenced Doakes, but he let Doakes do the work for him. That's one of the most fascinating aspects of their cat and mouse dynamic. Dexter saw the inevitability of Doakes' downfall long before it happened. All he had to do was let Doakes spiral deeper into his obsession. From a strategic perspective, Dexter understood something crucial. The more erratic Doakes seemed, the less credibility he had. If Dexter had simply killed him outright, that would have raised questions. Instead, he took advantage of Doakes' aggression, knowing that every angry outburst, every heated confrontation would push people further away from him. He didn't need to discredit Doakes. Doakes was doing that himself. This ties into the psychological concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Doakes believed Dexter was dangerous, but he also knew that Dexter was untouchable in the eyes of their colleagues. The more he tried to convince others, the more unhinged he looked. His downfall was a slow, inevitable march towards exactly the fate Dexter wanted for him. When Doakes finally found the blood slides, it should have been his moment of triumph. He had the hard evidence he had been missing all along. But instead of immediately taking them to higher authorities, he confronted Dexter directly. This was his biggest mistake, one born out of frustration, exhaustion, and sheer desperation. Psychologically, this was Doakes' breaking point. He had spent months trying to prove what he knew to be true, only to be met with ridicule or dismissal. Now, with undeniable proof in his hands, he didn't think rationally. He acted impulsively, cornering Dexter rather than securing his evidence. And once Dexter had him trapped, the game was over. This is a classic example of the emotional brain overriding the rational brain. In high-stress situations, even trained professionals can let emotions take over. Instead of methodically bringing Dexter down, Doakes allowed himself to be drawn into Dexter's trap. And once he was framed, there was no coming back. Dexter's framing of Doakes wasn't just about eliminating a threat, it was about controlling the narrative. If Doakes had simply disappeared, there would have been an investigation. But by making Doakes look like the Bay Harbor Butcher, Dexter not only erased his own crimes, but ensured that Doakes would never be able to clear his name. From a psychological manipulation standpoint, this was a masterstroke. Dexter took everything that made Doakes a good cop, his aggression, his obsession with justice, his inability to let things go, and turned it against him. He painted Doakes exactly what people expected him to be, a violent man with a secret life. And by the time Doakes was locked up in that cabin, he had no way to fight back. Even if he had escaped, he was already convicted in the court of public opinion. The tragedy of Doakes. The saddest part about Doakes' fate isn't just that he lost, it's that he never had a chance. Dexter played the long game using psychological warfare rather than brute force, and Doakes, for all his instincts and strength, was simply outmatched. If Doakes had approached things differently, if he had quietly gathered evidence instead of confronting Dexter so aggressively, he might have stood a chance. But that wasn't who he was. He was a man who acted on instinct, who pushed hard when he believed in something, and in the end, that was exactly what led to his downfall. Doakes' story is one of the most tragic in Dexter because it highlights a fundamental truth. Sometimes being right isn't enough. If you don't have support, the patience, or the strategic mind to play the game, the truth alone won't save you. And in a battle between raw instinct and calculated manipulation, the latter will always win. By the time Doakes was killed in an explosion, an event Dexter didn't even have to orchestrate himself, it was as if he had already been erased. The man who saw the truth, the only one who really understood Dexter, had been silenced, and the real monster walked away clean, free to kill again.